Hello and welcome to today's online forum on historic post office closures and relocations. My name is Jennifer Gates, Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. The format for today's online forum will include a presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and we will hold the question until the end for the presenters to answer. You will be muted throughout the presentation. To hide or unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Please adjust your volume on your computer or your phone. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, non-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure the protection of historic resources in California. A vital part of our advocacy mission is our ability to respond to a wide range of requests for assistance from around the state, from local questions to issues with statewide impacts. To help us stay current and knowledgeable about the wide range of advocacy issues, we have an advocacy committee and an advocacy task force. We are also forming a heritage network that will consist of small and large organizations and individuals across the state that are interested in working with CPF to advocate, promote, and educate about historic preservation. If you would like information about joining the Heritage Network, please contact me. As part of our ongoing advocacy efforts to reach a wide audience across the state, CPF is offering a series of online forums. Today's forum on post office closures is the third on statewide advocacy issues we addressed this year. Today's Historic Post Office Closures and Relocations Forum will be presented by Christina Morris, Senior Field Officer, and Brian Turner, Senior Field Officer and Attorney with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who will provide an overview of the U.S. Postal Service closure and relocation process around the country and how the National Trust is involved. I will then talk about ways organizations and individuals can get involved in the process and the post offices we are currently tracking, followed by Adrian Scott Fine, Director of Advocacy from the Los Angeles Conservancy, to talk about the ongoing advocacy efforts in the Los Angeles region and the lessons learned from the sale of the Venice Beach Post Office. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Morris, and thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this today. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and with everyone who's listening in on the phone. I am here today with my colleague, Brian Turner, from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we're a national nonprofit advocacy group that works to help save historic places across the country. Our organization has been following the post office closure issue for several years and trying to identify potential problems and solutions. I'll begin today by giving sort of a high-level overview of what's going on with the United States Postal Service, their closures and relocations, to the best of our understanding of what they are doing in specific locations around the country, and kind of give a high-level response to how we have evaluated these things and some of the strategies that we have adopted to try to identify some solutions. Brian will then pick up and talk specifically about how we have been following and engaging in some of the closures and relocations that are happening in California. As I mentioned, the National Trust has been following the Postal Service closure process for a number of years, and I wanted to begin first by talking about exactly what the causes are. I think a lot of people are just recognizing that their post offices are being closed or threatened in some way in their communities, and I think it's helpful to understand that there really is a very kind of long backstory to this. One of the reasons, I think one of the most important drivers of all of this is financial. For people who are not aware, the Postal Service is a governmental agency, but it also has kind of a private side to it as well, that they do have congressional mandates, and that is a large part of the problem that they are facing. The biggest financial crisis for them right now is that they have a congressional mandate to prepay their retiree health care benefits, and that is resulting in something close to an $11 billion deficit for the Postal Service. They also claim that they have a very considerable loss of their first-class postal revenue over the past several years, that they have seen a very steady decline in those rates in the the first-class Postal Service rates, as well as the revenue that that generates. And as an end result of that, they're looking at something in the neighborhood of a $22.5 billion deficit. The Postmaster General, Patrick Donahoe, was quoted last year as saying, "Our business model is broken, and if the Postal Service were actually a private company, they would be engaged in Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings right now. So it really is their financial crisis, and I don't think it's an understatement to call it a crisis, that is driving a lot of what they're doing with their facilities. And it's not just historic post offices that are being affected by this. They are looking at all of their holdings, which includes somewhere in the neighborhood of 35,000 properties across the country if you count all of their other facilities relating to delivery and processing. Initially, the Postal Service's response to this was to do a study of somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 to 4,400 post offices across the country. That number continued to shift last year. We weren't exactly sure how many they were looking at, but they did emphasize it was a study, although we were aware of the fact that post offices were starting to go through the process of closure and relocation. During that time, there was such an outcry in response to that, both at the public level and the legislative level, that the post office then changed their model. In recent conversations that we have had with the Postal Service, we have tried to understand exactly what this new model is. And it is something that they are calling their plan to profitability. It's a 5-year business plan that they have put in place, or that they are attempting to put in place, I should say. For anyone who's interested in it, there is a PowerPoint that the Postal Service has done on their plan to profitability, so you can see the details of that online if you just go Google USPS and plan to profitability. What you're seeing on the screen right now are the key points of that plan, and again, they all relate to making sure that the Postal Service ends up with some level of solvency. Most of the items relate to their delivery schedule and also to their personnel issues. So again, trying to create their own health care plan so that they don't have this pre-funded mandate for their retirees, and then also encouraging a very large number of their workers to take early retirement as a way of cost savings for them. And then the thing that I think is probably most relevant to the folks on the phone is that they want to reevaluate and, as they say, streamline 34,000 of their postal facilities. In our conversations with them earlier this year, they indicated that only a portion of those are actually retail postal facilities. A lot of these facilities actually relate to the delivery and processing of mail, as opposed to what we tend to think of as the historic post offices that are the face of the USPS in many towns. The National Trust, our response to this, once we heard last year that they were closing or looking at closing a large number of facilities, was to immediately to kind of raise a call to arms for this, to allow people to understand really what was going on. I think the biggest problem at that time last year when they announced that they were studying closures, and I think continues to be to this day, is the lack of communication and the lack of understanding of exactly what the Postal Service is doing and what the process is. So we took 2 steps fairly early on last year, the first one being to put historic post offices as one of our 11 most endangered places in America, to help people across the country understand that this is a very important issue that could have potentially a significant effect on their downtowns, because it was a problem that was going to affect both rural areas, urban areas, urban neighborhoods, and small towns across the country. We also listed the historic post offices as one of our national treasures, one of the 33 places across the country that we have designated as a national treasure, because we feel like it has such significance and such a potential to have a negative effect on communities across the country that we believed it was deserving of that status. If you want more information about either one of those efforts and the information that we have available, the website is listed there on this slide for you to go check them out. As a part of listing the historic post offices in this way, we attempted to kind of analyze the issues, the key issues, and identify some potential solutions to try to come up with a more holistic way to approach this. I think a big part of the problem that a lot of people have been facing is that they're dealing with an individual post office in their community. They have a hard time even finding out who they should be speaking to and what the process is, and we wanted to try to, our overarching goal here is to try to provide consistency to that process and to communicate with the public clearly about what that process is. and make sure that throughout the Postal Service is always meeting their requirements under Section 106 of the Federal Historic Preservation Act. So we have identified a couple of key items that we are very much in the process of trying to accomplish right now. The first one is to negotiate directly with the Advisory Council of Historic Places and the United States Postal Service to try to create some sort of national programmatic agreement. We feel like that would be the best way to provide consistency to the process so that everyone everywhere is aware of exactly what steps need to be taken and how they can engage directly in the process if they have a concern about the status of their historic post office in their community. We've also decided to get engaged as a consulting party directly in 3 post offices that are currently threatened with closure or sale. Those 3 post offices are Northfield, Minnesota, which you see on the left, the La Jolla Post Office, which you see in the center, and then the Berkeley Post Office in California, which you see on the right. And we have selected those places because they are currently furthest along in their process. The post office in Northfield, Minnesota is currently for sale, and also because there are a number of local organizations and nonprofit entities and advocacy groups that are very actively engaged in all 3 of these. The other components of our strategy include providing information and models directly to people so that they have some information about how they can get directly involved in their community if they are having issues with their post office. Again, going back to that issue of the fact that there is not a whole lot of communication that is coming from the Postal Service, and it's often very difficult to understand who you need to speak to and what steps you need to take. So you can always approach us for information and also look for information on our National Treasures page for the historic post offices. And also through forums like this, again, thanks to the California Preservation Foundation for allowing us to participate in this. 2 of the other items that we're looking at are opportunities to amend existing federal legislation. We know that there is legislation out there that perhaps will begin moving in the next legislative year, and there might be ways for us to amend some of that legislation as it relates to the Postal Service. They are going to be asking for changes in not only their service days, but also in the ways that they deal with their health care benefits for their employees, and if we can get enough legislative support, we might be able to add additional information in there in terms of how they actually handle their disposition process so that they are required to be in compliance with Section 106. And then finally, as a last case scenario, we are looking at legal action if all else fails as a way to force the Postal Service to comply with their regulatory requirements. So Brian, I will turn it over to you to speak to some issues specifically in California.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Brian Turner. I'm in the San Francisco field office at the National Trust, and I also want to thank Jennifer for organizing this forum. I'm going to go through a few slides pretty quickly because we have a lot of attendees. I'm sure we have a lot of questions out there. It would be great to get to some of them. But one thing that we're really seeing nationally is that California is a huge focus. It's really ground zero post office relocations right now. There's 106 historic post offices in California. At least 14 of them have been identified for relocation. Different theories about why this is happening. Some people have suggested that it's the real estate company that the USPS formed a partnership with is headquartered in California. Others talk about the high real estate value of many of these properties. And I attended a meeting in the Berkeley relocation recently, and this is basically, these are bullet points directly from the Postal Service. This is the process that they go through, the points. And of course, our central concern is where is the public participation in this, and where is the Section 106 review in particular? At what time can advocates get involved to make their voices heard, and consultation occur as it should? Because of course the Postal Service has obligations under the National Historic Preservation Act, just like any federal agency. The Postal Service has a regulatory process outside of the Section 106 review, and they have been hosting meetings in various cities where the proposed relocations are occurring. Generally, they give the public about 15 days to make their voices heard, following the hearing, and they've been very strict on deadlines. So if your comment isn't in 15 days, don't expect it to show up in the process. But ultimately, the recommendation for relocation is made by a district office, and the final decision is made by headquarters. Headquarters has to take into account community input. It's a requirement of the regulations. Now I just want to give a few perspectives on Section 106 in just a couple of minutes, and I'm going to do this in reference to 3 relocations we've seen in California, and just the voices I've heard. They seem to all be very consistent as far as how the process is happening. The first is Ukiah, which has been completed. The second is La Jolla, which is in the process of being completed, and the third is Berkeley, which is just starting. And so this is the Postal Service's perspective as far as 106 goes, that they've conceded that, theoretically the transfer of a historic asset from federal control to a private entity is a potential adverse effect, which of course would trigger their obligation to do a memorandum of agreement. But they've resisted calling it an adverse effect because of the imposition, because of the placement of covenant on the property. They have not put any dedicated any money for the enforcement of the covenant, but have placed the SHPO, authorized the SHPO to be the entity that enforces that agreement. The problem that we have with this is that, as you can see from the Advisory Council's response, is that the California SHPO has claimed that it's not authorized by state law to accept a covenant or easement. So of course it raises the legal question of, can you have a covenant if the receiver of the covenant and the enforcer refuses to acknowledge that it exists? And I think that's a legal question that remains open at the moment. But nonetheless, the Postal Service, despite the Advisory Council's disagreement with their findings of no adverse effect, has been simply disagreeing and moving on per their per the Section 106 regulations. The ACHP, I think, seeing that a lot of these are being done on a case-by-case basis, they've acknowledged, as Chris pointed out, that these consultations have been uneven, and they've encouraged a programmatic solution. But we haven't heard any directly much willingness from the Postal Service to engage in that solution, and we're hopeful that will change. Finally, I talked a little bit about the SHPO's perspective. Here's a few points that I think we've been hearing from the advocates. Big concerns with the way these relocation decisions are happening. The first is a general lack of communication. Section 106 regulations encourage consultation to be done as early as possible in the planning process. Right now, we're still very confused as to when that process is even beginning. The National Trust sent a letter expressing some concerns with Berkeley, which you see depicted here, and we were told that we're premature in our request, even though they've already hosted a meeting in the community identifying the post office as one that is to be relocated. It's undoubtedly a beautiful historic building, and of course we're concerned with what modifications could be made in the event it's sold to a private developer. Secondly, this seeming preference for the transfer of historic assets, it just seems that there's a disproportionate amount of the properties that are being relocated are in gorgeous historic buildings, and maybe that just speaks to the fact that our historic assets are generally economically valuable commodities. They were built really well. They have beautiful architecture, but that's a concern. We've also heard general concern with the historic use of the building as a post office, as a public place in particular, and the ending of that use. As I mentioned, the funding for covenant enforcement generally in the preservation world, it's common practice to provide some funding for the enforcer of an easement or a covenant. In this case, the Postal Service has not offered a dime of the proceeds from the building for that protection. Finally, a lot of these post offices have beautiful murals done in the New Deal era, and of course public accessibility is a very common concern. And I'll leave it to Chris just to wrap. I'm not sure if you wanted to say something, Chris, or just move to Jennifer.
No, that's okay. Jennifer, you can go ahead and launch into your component if you'd like.
All right, sounds good. So I wanted to touch on how to get involved and signs to look for in your own communities, and also ways to participate. So first, the signs to look for. There's a couple of different ways to find out about it. One of the things that some of these communities is all of a sudden in their post office there was a sign that was posted in the window that stated that there was a potential relocation or closure discussion. Also, in all communities, there's always those that are in the know, and things circulate, all the talk about it. So is it circulating around your community? If it is circulating, there is a potentially that actually has legs, and it's also going to be a matter of identifying who may know more about what's going on in that post office, and that would be your postmaster. One of the big things to know when getting more information is to always ask, is this a relocation or a closure? Those are two very different things. They have different processes. We will provide you with more information afterwards with what the differences are and where you can find information. As was stated in 2011, there was a list that came out, but those were only closures. And what we're finding is a lot of the communities that we're currently working with are actually relocations. Also, look for a public meeting that is being scheduled by the Postal Service to actually discuss this issue. And remember that these decisions can be appealed. As you can see here, I note that to relocate Postal Services, it's a 15-day period for comments. For closures, it's a 30-day period. So again, whether you're a relocation or a closure is important to know. And who can appeal is also provided to you. It's very important to continue advocating for your post offices, and different ways you can do that is, to participate in the process and sharing your comments, either written letters. We will provide you with some of those contacts at the state and as well as national level, the Postal Service, as well as our contact information, as well as going to the public meetings and participating there. What's also very important is to engage your local, state, and federally elected officials. It is very important, and we've seen a lot more traction and press information being released in those communities that are effective in getting their local, state, and federal officials involved, and also writing comment letters to the Postal Service. Something, just in the long haul, and something to think about, if the appeal is denied, is to identify and potential preservation-minded buyers. Something always to think about too. In the end, the Postal Service will sell to the person or entity under terms which are in their best interest, and they have stated that. So again, participate in the Section 106 process. We were talking about when the best time to actually request consulting party status is, and we think it's probably best after an appeal is denied at this time to send in your request. You can always send in your letters early, and then you may get a letter that says it's too early, but at least you're on the radar. Also that, to be a consulting party status, that you need to be an individual organization with a demonstrated interest, and we can talk more about that if you have specific questions in your community. But it is subject to the Postal Service approval. We have requested consulting party status twice and have not received a letter back either confirming or denying consulting party status. but we will send a letter for each post office as it comes about from now on. We send a general letter about all post offices. Also, keep aware that there's deed restriction or covenants that are being potentially placed on these post offices, ensuring that they are placed. But then again, as we talked earlier, there is an issue about who is able to enforce these covenants, especially without any funding. To protect these historic post offices, a lot of the post offices are actually not listed or have already been determined eligible for listing on the National Register. So, find out more information about your post office. Is it listed locally on the state level on the National Register? When it goes through the 106 process, to make sure it does go through the 106 process. And then when it does, make sure those our protective covenants are on the property as part of that sale, and that it includes those character-defining features that should be protected. And as we stated earlier, the artwork is not for sale, but it should be reasonably accessible is the term that they have used to the public, or it potentially will be moved to another location. There's a lot of information out there on websites. Here's some of them. I will send out our final presentation to everyone that has registered for this, as well as put it up on our website for you so that you can have these websites. So right now, California Preservation Foundation is tracking the following post offices. This is not, this is all the ones that we have heard about from the communities or have found information on through searching different websites. I think there's potentially more out there, but we rely on our local organizations and individuals to let us know what's going on in their communities. So I'm just going to real quickly go through these for you, and just to let you know the variety of resources here in California that we're currently looking at. So as we talked earlier, Berkeley's on the list, and they are going to have a public meeting on November 20th, and you can find more information about that public meeting on Living New Deal website. And this property is listed on the National Register. Here we have a Burlingame. It is currently listed on the USPS Properties for Sale website that CBRE manages. So you can go to that website and see all the post offices. I think as of yesterday there were 11 or 12 post offices listed for sale in California, or as coming soon, as this one is. Fullerton, the status is unknown. It was removed from the coming soon list on that website. It was originally on the list of potential closures from the 2011 list, and so we're not quite sure what the status is at this time. Huntington Beach was also listed on a possible closure list, and again, that status is unknown. It is locally listed. La Jolla is in the Section 106 process currently. You can see it's a very active group, and they had a Halloween-themed post office rally. Modesto is listed on the National Register, and it sold last year. And the future use that I read about was a conversion to 11 loft units, and that the lobby will have the restored murals visible and open. This is in orange, it's the Orange Plaza. The status also is unknown and also was listed on our original closure list. This is Palo Alto. It is listed as coming soon. Redlands was also originally listed on the coming soon list, but has been removed. So again, we're tracking this one. Sacramento was part of a larger federal building, and the building itself is listed on the National Register. It was supposed to be closed in July, and my status right now is I'm not quite sure that it did close for sure yet. San Rafael is also listed, and it is as coming soon. Santa Barbara. Santa Monica recently or had their public meeting. They did appeal. The appeal was denied. That's when more information came out about the difference between a relocation and a closure in the appeal period. And they have been very active, as well as La Jolla and Venice, in getting their federally elected officials involved in this. Here's Southgate. Ukiah also sold this year. The future use at this time is unknown, and it has been heard that the mural had been removed prior to the sale to be restored. I had also heard that it would potentially be placed in the larger facility that they have in the city. And lastly, Venice also sold, and we're going to hear more about that right now as I turn it over to Adrian.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. This is, again, Adrian Fine with LA Conservancy, Director of Advocacy. So I want to say thanks to Chris, Brian, and Jennifer for doing such a great job in kind of setting the stage. In terms of what I'm going to talk about is our involvement. Obviously, we're based in LA County. And have a series of post offices that we're concerned about, but we've really been focused for the past year and a half on Venice. And it's California is kind of the epicenter for post office issues in terms of how these things are playing out. Venice has been really a poster child in terms of a lot of focus, in terms of how well it worked, but also the process and what we learned through that. So this really is kind of where the rubber hits the road. In terms of our experience on the ground and what we've learned in working with the Postal Service, the State Preservation Office, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, local advocates, elected officials, you name it, everybody has been involved, as well as the National Trust in the Venice issue. And so I think it has some good application in terms of what's been brought up already in terms of issues. So we have had anywhere from up to 30 post offices in Los Angeles County that have been identified for disposal through sale, either through relocation or closure. And as Jennifer said, those are two very distinct definitions by the Postal Service in terms of process. The Venice Post Office is an example of a relocation. It's closing, but the services are relocating, in this case, across the street to a new facility. But these are some of the other post offices that we're keeping an eye on or getting involved. Santa Monica is probably the one that we're most involved with, I would say, right now, because it's kind of the next in line, I would say, within our area. The other piece to this is in terms of how people are advocating for saving post offices or getting involved. There's typically a two-pronged process. Initially, it's starting to save the post office in terms of its use, and that's all well and good. These are community anchors, and that's important. And then the second piece of that process is if and when you cannot prevail on that particular fight with the Postal Service, and most aren't, it's then the fight is how do we protect the building and ensure if it goes into private hands, it's protected. Things like murals are accessible and conserved. So that's really been our focus with this as well, more on the protecting the building, and that's where really the Los Angeles Conservancy is plugged in. So like I said, we've been involved for about a year and a half. Our involvement started around April 2011, and quite honestly, we're still involved, even though the building has been sold, but it's certainly not as active as we were. And it's not just us. It was the Venice Neighborhood Council. It was Venice Stakeholders Association. It was, again, local residents, city councilmen for that district. Everybody had a different role to play in this. And I will say our experience, like Brian said, it's been fairly inconsistent, uneven, and not exactly transparent in terms of understanding the process. But this gives you a sense of the site. Highly valuable site, very close to the beach. It's a 1939 building, New Deal era structure. And so that was what's at risk. This is the building itself, about 24,000 square feet in size, very similar to a lot of other post offices buildings around California and the country. It's about 3/4 of an acre in size. The piece that's in green on this image, that's a later addition that was made to the building, but all part of the parcel that was up for grabs in terms of its relocation, closure, and sale. And again, if you look at this image, again, very typical to a lot of post offices around California and elsewhere in terms of its basic building form, and usually each one is kind of adorned in a different architectural style to that particular community. And then the building, as you see it today, it is National Register eligible. When it was placed up for sale, it had a kind of fits and starts in terms of when it was officially for sale. It went for sale, then it was taken off the market, went back on for sale due to some appeals that local community groups were pressing the Postal Service in terms of their decision that they were making on closure. But ultimately went up for sale with an asking price of $7.5 million, with bids due on April 23rd of this year. And so that's what we were dealing with. Now, Brian mentioned the issue of the murals. That's been a big focus. About 800 post offices around the country, or 32% of post offices, have this type of New Deal era mural in it, and that's what's in Venice as well as others. And there was a lot of concern about not just saving the building, but making sure that the mural was conserved and preserved. And we also, in looking at kind of figuring out character-defining features of this particular post office and others, we found this very common in terms of a mural centered over the main door on the kind of the end of the building with bulletin boards. That door in many post offices, including Venice, was the postmaster's office originally. So that was really kind of symbolic that the postmaster was very accessible to the public in terms of when these buildings were built, and this whole arrangement with the mural above those. And so in terms of our work here, it was looking at the mural, and one thing we certainly learned in that process is there's a different process in regards to the mural. The Postal Service can sell a building, but they can't sell the mural. They have to maintain ownership of the mural indefinitely as part of the policy here. So what usually happens is when they sell the building, they will then set some type of agreement with a new owner to ensure that the mural is conserved, and hopefully that there's some public accessibility provision built into that. In some cases, they've removed the mural, but they still maintain ownership of it. In terms of our process, lots of letter writing. That's kind of what happens. We were an official consulting party, so we were accepted into the process. And again, I would say intense 106 process on Venice was really from August to 2011 to August of 2012. So a full year of various correspondence back and forth between us and other groups and the Postal Service. And you'll see our letters are a little more detailed and lots of information, and usually the Postal Service letter was a little bit more to the point in here. And one of the main issues that we had that Brian alluded to was the issue of the draft covenant that the Postal Service put forward as far as saying that this would address the adverse effect finding. Again, this goes back to when they sell a building out of federal ownership, it triggers essentially an adverse effect finding because well, it does, but you need to have some type of adequate or legally enforceable restriction or condition in place to ensure preservation or long-term preservation in place. And our concern specifically with the draft covenant that the Postal Service put forward is that, again, there's no willing entity accept the covenant. There was no real good language that we felt in there that provided a base level of long-term protection. There were issues of historic features identified within or stated within the covenant, but no baseline documentation to correspond to that. So those are some of our concerns with that. And much of our work was going back and forth with the Postal Service, including calls with the Postal Service as part of consulting party process, stating our concerns and questions about what was happening. Ultimately, we as a consulting party, wrote to the Postal Service as well as the Advisory Council and formally, which we had to do within a 30-day period, disagreed with the Postal Service's finding that there would be no adverse effect here with their draft covenant. And that then triggered a whole other discussion about if that draft covenant was not sufficient, how are we going to address that? And that's where we started a whole other discussion with the Postal Service as well as others, including a prospective owner here, about how to address the issue of an adverse effect finding here and ensuring that there's protection for the building. So what you have before you here is a very rough timeline, I would say, of our involvement, and it really should actually start from around April 2011 when they started a series of community rallies all through the summer of that year to kind of protest the sale of the post office in Venice. Some of this happened in chronological, some of it happened at the same time. Really back in March, we started working with a prospective owner or prospective buyer of the building, and up until when they purchased it, and this was Joel Silver, the film producer, up until he purchased the building in August, we were working with the State Historic Preservation Office, Advisory Council, the National Trust, CPF, local community groups, as well as the City of Los Angeles, which actually became a key player in this, to figure out a way to address, again, the adverse effect issue and figuring out a way to have protection for this building once it transfers. And ultimately, what happened in this case, which is, I would say, a creative solution and unusual solution, is the City of Los Angeles stepped up, and they deserve a lot of credit with the Office of Historic Resources, where they agreed to take a covenant on the building from the Postal Service for long-term protection of the building. And in that process, they require baseline documentation of the building so that we could identify the character-defining features that had to be protected, knowing that the building would have a new use. In this case, Mr. Silver was purchasing the building, for his production offices. And so that was a very helpful process and very creative solution that ultimately allowed this sale to move forward and allowed the Postal Service to adhere to the Section 106 process, because we could ensure some meaningful long-term protection for the building. And as a kind of an example, or one example of how this has worked, it's moved forward. Mr. Silver, shown here in this slide, this was in October, early October, when they did the grand kind of press conference. And I will say it was a little different than a typical press conference, very Hollywood style, in terms of valet and catered food. But the basic purpose of this was to show to the community what his idea was in reusing the building, how he was going to preserve the building, maintain the prominent features that everyone has known and loved about the Venice Post Office, including the exterior as well as the interior mural, which he did enter into an agreement with the Postal Service to preserve and conserve. So what we're looking at now with Venice, the building it's closed as a post office. Mr. Silver now owns it as of August, and he's now currently undergoing rehabilitation of the building for his offices and studio. That's an 18-month process. He'll reopen sometime in 2014. The Conservancy will work to do some type of tours, of public programming, to ensure people still have some visibility and can still see the mural once it's conserved and preserved back into its location. And then this has been really good experience as far as a lot of things that we've learned from this process that we're now translating to other examples, working very closely with the Santa Monica Conservancy, with their post office, which is almost exactly a year behind where we were on Venice in terms of process, where the appeal in terms of its closure was just recently denied by the Postal Service. But one thing that we did learn, and that Santa Monica is pursuing, is that they're pursuing local designation, landmark designation right now. even though the Postal Service doesn't give their consent to that, and that you have no control over the Postal Service, once it does transfer into private hands, it is kind of a safeguard measure because it's then in place for private owners. So we've learned that Santa Monica has the ability to do that. Places like Glendale have already locally landmarked their post office, as well as Southgate has also done that. So to wrap up, I would say some key lessons that we've learned from this process. One, keeping everyone in the loop, including, if you've got a preservation organization, if you're working with the State Historic Preservation Office. We talked a lot with the Advisory Council, and they were really helpful, as well as the National Trust, as well as, just all the partners. So everyone knows where things are moving. Two, I would say, follow the process. Again, you have a Section 106 process here. It's not perfect, and it's not always, again, understandable in terms of the process, but it's the best vehicle to try to negotiate with the Postal Service and try to get something better in terms of preservation down the road. Three, again, I think there's various models for attempting to achieve protection. We came up with a creative solution in Venice that may be applicable to another community. So press the Postal Service to look at other options other than their draft covenant, which is mostly not very enforceable if you don't have a group that's really agreeing to accept it. Four is, I think it's been stated already, but using those political connections. We did the whole congressional outreach, working with the mayor, working with the council office. All of that was really critical. Whether it ultimately influenced the Postal Service, I don't know for sure, but we kept the pressure on. And then last, I would just say be persistent, that this is not for the faint of heart, but it's certainly something you have to keep on. Otherwise, the Postal Service will just kind of keep moving without you. So I'll end it there.
Thank you. And thank you all for all that valuable information today. So as right now, if you could type in your questions and to share with us, and I will go ahead and start asking the questions of all the presenters today. So the first question that I have is in regards to the process. And right now, so the first question in regards to the process is, who makes the decisions to put the post offices on the sale list, and also the ultimate decision that it is going to be closed or relocated?
This is Chris. I can try to take a stab at that one, although I don't know that I actually have an answer to that, which is a very, very good question. And Jennifer and Adrian and Brian, feel free to jump in here as well. The last communication that we had with the Postal Service about any of this directly was after they had announced their plan to profitability and the fact that they were not going to be studying 4,400 post offices for closure. The way that we understand they are operating right now, they made a decision to begin their new process in California, and they are looking at a number of factors in making their decisions about which post offices to close. They described it as almost an algorithmic process where they're looking at a number of factors that can include but aren't limited to the size of the community, the service needs of the community, the distances traveled by their delivery people, the current leasing terms, because about 70% of the current postal facilities are actually leased, and the number of people that actually work in those facilities, their overhead costs, all of that are being considered and factored into making these decisions. The people who actually make the final decisions, to the best of my knowledge, is the Vice President of Facilities, a man named Tom Samra, although I wouldn't swear to that as being 100% accurate. I think there are recommendations that are made, and then ultimately decisions are made by him or by his staff as to which post offices actually get closed and which get relocated.
There was a follow-up question to that, and it's in regards to who the best person to contact to protest either a decision or a process issue. And we will put together a list of those main contacts, as I said earlier. And also with your individual post office, when they're in process, they do have identified individuals for this process in each community. And then also with each process, there's identified people. The next question is in regards to where to get lists of post office facilities sold that reveal buyer and amount of sale. Just from looking at the different ones that have sold across the state. Some of that information, if the buyer wants to let the community know that they have purchased the property, that's when most of the people find out, and it's placed typically into the community newspaper. Ukiah, when I last looked, still had not been made public who purchased it or for how much and what its future use would be. I don't know if any of our other speakers had a comment about that.
I don't have anything more, Jennifer.
Okay. The next question is in regards to future use, and the question is worded, what works for public-private joint ownership so lobby and services may remain and operate while improvements are made to the back of the building with construction that offers housing and ground floor stores without defacing historic structure? And I think that question can be broadened into what the goal is for preserving the historic resources with future uses.
So what's the question there, Jennifer?
The question I would say would be what is the goal in adaptively reusing these structures to preserve the historic structure, and what types of uses could meet those goals potentially?
Well, I can say, again, from the Venice situation, we did a kind of, did the documentation, or the documentation was done on the building to identify what are the character-defining features of that building that are kind of the sacred cows that you can't mess with. And obviously that's the exterior of the building, especially the front facade was called out, and then again the lobby and the mural and the thing like the postmaster door, the fact that it's there, that those are the features that were called out. By and large, with that building as well as a lot of these post office buildings, the back-of-house kind of functions are pretty utilitarian that do give you more leeway in terms of, latitude of making changes or dividing it up for, offices or whatever uses. But we've seen, the Venice one's being turned into production offices, and there's also a full basement that allows a lot of space for that too. But there's examples of post offices, and I think we probably need to compile some of these or more examples of these around the country that have been converted for architectural offices, for restaurants, for other types of offices, art galleries. So there's a lot of uses that could go into these buildings while still maintaining their primary character-defining features. So I think it's just making sure that there's enough protection and safeguards to ensure that you're not jeopardizing any of those features.
And I would just add to that that I think the Postal Service has a particular goal, and advocates generally have another goal, and the Postal Service is primarily interested in revenue, and that's what they've said again and again and again. I think from an advocate's perspective, one of the more compelling arguments is that, as much public access as possible. These buildings were designed to be available for the public. The murals were designed to be looked at by the public, and celebrations of kind of civic, celebrations of civic pride, and so we're always looking at, the best potential public use as being one that's open to people.
The next question is in regards to letters. So are there any letters written to and from the Postal Service available for review online to serve as models for others to follow?
I mean, we have, at the Conservancy, we have our letters that we've sent. I don't think we posted the response letters from the Postal Service. But maybe, Jennifer, through us, we can somehow make some of that available.
Sure, and we can identify the types of things to make sure to include in your letter so that the Postal Service will respond to that comment.
Right.
And this is Chris. That's something else that we're looking at is what kind of examples we would be able to post and make available through our website so that people can see the letters, the correspondence that we have. But I think also, Adrian, the correspondence that we saw between you and Venice, particularly what we were seeing coming back from the post office, has been incredibly helpful for us in understanding what they're doing and the strategies that they're taking and how we can kind of most effectively counter those.
Sounds good. The next question, are there any circa 1960s properties on the roster or in a preservation process?
I can take a stab at that. There are. I mean, it runs the gamut in terms of what's on the list for closure or relocation, which could be, you know, these New Deal era kind of traditional post office buildings to spaces that are in leased areas to post-war facilities. So it's a range of things. Part of it is we don't know enough about what's on the hit list, so to speak. I don't know, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about the context that's on mid-century or post-war facilities?
Did we lose her?
Well, I can fill in.
We have lost Chris. You go ahead, Adrian.
I will do my best, but and Chris just kind of filled us in a little bit on the status of this. But the Postal Service has previously done a context that looked at their historic resources, but that was done in the mid-'80s. And they did a series that they listed on the National Register or identified as being eligible for the National Register. When this first hit, as far as 4,400, postal services to be relocated or closed, there was some concern about, well, what about the next generation of facilities that are from the 1950s and 60s that aren't on anybody's radar screen and no one knows any information about that. So the Postal Service said they were doing the context. What we've heard most recently is that they've done, maybe it's like a mini-light context that gives you some perspective in terms of the growth of the Postal Service and their facilities during that post-war era, that you can then at each state level and community level, for that matter, evaluate whether or not your resource might be significant from that standpoint. So I don't think there's a great survey out there, but I think there is soon to be some more of a context, and our understanding that's supposed to be posted on the Postal Service's website soon.
Thanks, Adrian. Sorry, I need to learn how to use the mute button.
A question that came up that I think is very important to cover today before we end is, if your community has a historic preservation ordinance in place, wouldn't the sale of a post office building and future use automatically be protected and enforced by the city?
I can speak to that maybe. Indeed, it can, but we also have to acknowledge that those ordinances can always be changed. And the difference with an effective covenant is that it runs with the land, so it applies to whoever owns the property in perpetuity, and that, I guess, would be the key difference. So there's a variety of different protections that apply at the state level as well with CEQA, and even 106, could apply if there's federal involvement. But a covenant is by far the strongest potential protection because it runs with the land over time.
I think it's also, is that post office listed locally, or, do you have an ordinance that's written in such that any property listed or are eligible for the National Register is automatically listed locally? Because it just depends on how your ordinance is worded and what protections there are in place. Another question that has come up is, what is considered artwork in these post offices? Does it include the brass work that's in a lot of these post offices?
My understanding, it's pretty focused on the murals. Maybe someone has more explanation on that, but my understanding is it's on the actual artwork that's brought in artists to commission the murals, and that's what you mostly see is murals.
This is Chris. I would imagine, though, that some of those, I mean, particularly the artwork that's specific to the period of construction, anything that would be sort of the WP era, the metalwork and all of those things, would be considered character-defining features, though, and so that you would want to acknowledge all of that and protect all of that, even though it may not qualify as the artwork in terms of the murals that the Postal Service would be required to protect in the way that the murals are protected.
Another question, what is GSA's role in this process, since they are the owners of several post office buildings across the United States?
Great question. I don't know that I can answer it. I haven't heard of GSA being involved or taking the lead in any of the consultations.
I have not either. We have actually looked to GSA as perhaps a model for how this disposition process could be done, given that they are such a landholder. But I was not aware that they were involved. That only the Postal Service was.
I think all the post offices that have been identified are under for closure are under Postal Service ownership, and that's why they're the lead. And that. Very few of the relocations are actually GSA properties. So they may not play a role in this, except from the owner of it with the Postal Service as a tenant. I'm going to do one more question. There are a couple more, and we will work as a group to get answers to these remaining questions to send out to you guys later today or this week with a copy of the slides from today's presentation for you all. And that question is, how does the USPS go about notifying a community about that there is going to be a public meeting about their post office closure?
I don't know if anybody's going to take that.
Sorry.
I hate to say, kind of inconsistent process. I mean, some I think have been more stalwart in terms of pressing the Postal Service in terms of where the process is, and then you've had a public meeting, which wasn't that long ago, that happened in Santa Monica. Also, about a year ago or so, happened in Venice too. But it's not clear to me in terms of how if that's consistently being done in each and every one of these examples. I mean, I think notices are happening, but I'm not sure about meetings.
All right. Well, thank you all again for joining us today. We really appreciate it for all your great insight on the process and what's been going on the past couple of years. We also thank you all for joining us and providing your great questions. You will receive an email later today with a link to a survey in regards to this online forum, and we would appreciate any feedback on it, as well as recommendations for future topics on statewide issues. Like I said, you will receive and also a link to the PowerPoint from today. This presentation has been recorded and will be available to others in the public to view in the future from our website. And thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.